Bitcoin Matters.
This week, we're having a more off-the-cuff, oddball discussion talking about libertarianism as a political philosophy and how it relates to Bitcoin, along with Bitcoin technology. Okay, so let's talk about libertarianism as a political philosophy. And in general, how would you describe libertarianism?
Libertarianism is essentially the non-aggression axiom, which means that you're not allowed to initiate force against other people. You're only allowed to freely interact with people without using violence. And most normal people would accept that that's the proper way to do things. Unfortunately, when you question them about the state and violence and ask them to define violence, they have essentially a problem, and they hold two conflicting definitions of violence in their heads at the same time. They think that the state doing things using violence is not real violence, and when people do those same things, that it is violence. You can most readily see this when they use the construction, we are doing it to ourselves, or something like that. So libertarianism is actually a very normal philosophy for most people. What's abnormal is the putting the state and the people who work for the state in a special super class of people that are not subject to the same rules that everybody else is. And I think if people understood this, the idea of libertarianism wouldn't be a separate thing to their normal thought. They'd understand that they are actually libertarians. They are actually libertarians themselves. And what's been done to them is that they've been brainwashed so that they hold two contradicting views and two contradicting ideas in their head at the same time. Apply one set of rules to the state and people who work there, and another set of rules to themselves and their neighbors and quote unquote ordinary people who are not allowed to use force.
Yeah, and I'm on the Wikipedia page right now for libertarianism, and very basic.
Bad idea.
Yeah, of course. Don't ever trust Wikipedia, kids. But it does say, and I think this is just some food for thought here, libertarians in general seek to maximize political freedom and autonomy, emphasizing freedom of choice, voluntary association, and individual judgment.
See, that's absolute nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. Libertarianism is about the non-aggression axiom. That's what it's about. And all that other stuff can or cannot come as a consequence of not initiating force. That's the core of libertarianism. And you must be very, very careful of looking for definitions of these controversial subjects from a place like Wikipedia, which has an army of normie statist editors who police that place so that it doesn't tell the truth. So the last place you want to look for definition of libertarianism is Wikipedia. If you want to understand about libertarianism, you go to Mises.org, and they have every possible resource there for you to understand what libertarianism is actually about. And the number one book, which I've been recommending for years, is For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard. You can download that book for free from Mises.org, and that will put the case for libertarianism to you in a way that can't be refuted. It's not possible to say that anything in that book is wrong. So once you've read that book, then you'll understand what libertarianism is, and more importantly, you'll understand how it applies to money and to how people conduct themselves in society.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. Wikipedia is totally a statist-run crockpot of a bunch of wackos. I like to reference it occasionally just to get an idea of some basic definitions, but you're right, it's hardly trustworthy half the time.
It's good for chemistry and physics.
Non-sectarian.
Exactly. Anything to do with philosophy. It's very unreliable. I often use Wikipedia to look up things to do with chemistry and physics, and it's normally quite good for that. But I wouldn't trust it for anything else, essentially.
So what interests me about libertarianism, and I think and leading into how it sort of relates to Bitcoin, is, the word libertarian comes from the word liberty, right? And that is just another word for freedom. And libertarians I don't know how much they know about Bitcoin as a, as a political, libertarians as a political movement. I don't know how much they're aware of Bitcoin, but talk about in your mind why a libertarian might really be interested in Bitcoin.
A libertarian would be interested in Bitcoin because it's a way of having money, a fixed supply, without any mass. And so if you're interested in the ideas of libertarianism and the Austrian School of Economics, Bitcoin should be very, very interesting for you because it's a way of proving whether or not Austrianism can work in the real world or not. And the way that the gold market and gold supply and the way that gold is bought and sold all over the world, it's interfered with by the state. It's not possible for it at the moment to act like real money, whereas the Bitcoin can, because it's not under anybody's control. It can be sent from A to B instantly, and so it's more directly exposed to the market, whereas gold is not. And of course, no matter what happens with the state and the rules about how gold is bought and sold, gold can never be transmitted instantly over the internet. So Bitcoin has the advantage of not being physical. So that's why libertarians should be very interested in Bitcoin. And there are a couple of libertarians who haven't really understood what Bitcoin is. And I think that's prevented them from looking at it seriously, but they really should look at it seriously. And the ones that do, and the light bulb goes off on, they understand this is something very, very important, even if it's just as an experiment to find out what a system like this could produce in the market. So I think it's something that all libertarians should take very, very seriously. Unfortunately, because we're talking about software and a very complex system, and all the narratives to do with Bitcoin have been from that perspective, people who are sort of libertarian political thinkers haven't had an inroads into understanding Bitcoin because there's a lot of jargon that people have been using, correct or incorrect, it doesn't make a difference. They've been using a lot of jargon to explain how Bitcoin works. And in fact, that jargon is a barrier to entry to many people. The best, and this is what we've been discussing with Azteco, is that the way that you describe Bitcoin has to be simplified so that you're not thinking about all of the mechanisms that make it possible. If anybody was tried to have something sold to them based on the technical merits alone, you would never get things like Twitter or SMS sold to ordinary people because they're just not capable of understanding how those things work under the hood. So the same thing has to happen with Bitcoin. And libertarianism and the people who follow it are very clever, but they're clever in the things that they're clever at, not at software and not at all the gubbins that make things work. So I think if we want to get these people on board and to get them to think about Bitcoin seriously, the approach to them has to be on a level that they're able to understand. And if we don't make that approach on a level they're able to understand, they just shut off.
Absolutely. It'd be like trying to introduce someone to the joys of the internet back in the 90s, or maybe even the late 80s or something, where you had to have pretty high technical knowledge in order to be able to work a computer. It wasn't until people built software, user interface in mind, and like a GUI, graphical user interface in mind, that sort of technology became more adapted to the masses adapted it. And now you have a global population basically using this stuff on a daily basis for everything. Bitcoin has to go through the same process, and it's slowly taking place, and it's getting better. I was not involved with Bitcoin when it started nearly 10 years ago. So Akin, you might have been more familiar with it back in the day, but I'm sure it's come a long way since it started, right?
It's come a long way. And to go back to the example of how the internet used to work in the 1990s, everybody who wanted to access the internet had to log on and start a session with a modem. So your computer was not on all the time. You had to dial a number, log into your service provider, and then you'd be on the internet. And then when you finish your session, you'd hang up and the computer wouldn't be online anymore. So today, nobody does that. Everybody's online all the time. They never turn their machines off from the internet, well, shut their machines off, disconnect their machines from the internet. So that's a sea change in the way people go online. And something similar to that has to happen with Bitcoin, where all of the barriers to using it are removed. So that when you want to send some money, the bare minimum task, the bare minimum process that you need to do should be, in the case of Face ID, looking at your phone to unlock your wallet. That should be the absolute bare minimum. Nothing more than that. And if you have to do more steps than that, then you immediately exclude millions of people from being able to use your services. So it's very important to understand how people use their tools, what people expect from their tools, like not having to log in every time they use them. I mean, just imagine if somebody was using Instagram and every time they wanted to send an Insta, as they call them, they had to log in with two-factor authentication. That's just unthinkable. The same thing has to happen with Bitcoin. But of course, because Bitcoin is money, there is an incentive to steal it. So you need to have some authentication every time you send your money. The question is what authentication and how easy is it to use and implement. And as creepy as it is, Face ID is the sort of thing that really has to be integrated into Bitcoin wallets because it's very simple to use. It seems to be secure on its face, but that's the kind of thing that has to be integrated into services. Otherwise, you're going to exclude a lot of people. And we want more people to be using Bitcoin, not less.
So, and for our listeners right now, the way it works is if you want to store your Bitcoin, I'm not going to get into the super technical side of it, but you're basically given a set of keys and you have to formulate a pretty complex set of private keys for yourself. It's like usually most of these services, wallet services, have like a 16 phrase seed.
Mnemonic, it's called.
Mnemonic. And it's just a bunch of random words that you basically either need to memorize or you write it down on a piece of paper and put it somewhere safe. And it's, you know, I just don't think that Bitcoin has quite had its iPhone moment yet, as I like to call it, where it's like, aha, oh, wow. Now it's just so, oh, it's so sleek and easy to use. And it just makes it so simple. We haven't reached that point yet. We're still developing the internet part of it, so to speak, like the internet was being built in the 90s before it really boomed.
I think that stage is definitely going to come. And what will happen is that you'll have tiered services. So the bottom tier will be the simplest, where a Face ID will be used to log in, and then you just tap out the amount you want to send or just scan the amount you want to send with your phone and then just press send. So it's basically 3 steps to send. And you will keep maybe $100, $200 in the low tier. Then the next tier up will be for more money, like home storage or something like that. And then there'll be the corporate tier, which is at the absolute top, where the very arcane best practices for safety and paper backups and everything is the standard. But then you have professionals who are managing all that as a full-time job. So this stratified way of looking at how Bitcoin can be interacted with, I think, is a very sensible way to break up the stream or the stack of user requirements so that you can start building tools to serve each stack. The lowest tier, where Azteca was working, where we're delivering Bitcoin for everyday use, doesn't require people to use mnemonics and that kind of stuff, although of course they can. If you get Samurai Wallet, you get all that bundled along by default. But if you're only keeping $100 on your phone so that you can buy reads on a newspaper online or something like that, then you really don't need this bank grade, corporate grade security that you have to actually interact with. Obviously, the corporate bank grade security can be built into the app and abstracted away from you so you don't see it. But you shouldn't be expected to interact with it just to send a newspaper 10 cents. That doesn't make any sense at all, not even 10. So once people start to understand the different strata that are basically spontaneously comes into existence, depending on how much Bitcoin you're dealing with and the sort of user you're dealing with, the applications and systems and processes to manage those scenarios will become obvious, and then people will start to build for them, and they'll make money building those services. And one very interesting company that's doing that is Casa Hotel, and they've got some very interesting products that are for more Bitcoin than your daily spend off of your Samurai wallet. So these products and services are being developed in the market. They're emerging from the market. And as long as people are allowed to develop freely without having to jump through any hoops created by the state, these solutions will emerge and make everything useful for everybody. What must not happen is that a bunch of apparatchiks and anti-Bitcoiners and no-coiners try and supervise the creation of these services and implementation of standards and all sorts of other stuff, which has nothing to do with the provision of service and the design of the services. They don't have any stake in the creation of these things, and so they have no business whatsoever telling people how to write software. And that's one of the biggest problems with something like BitLicense, because if you want to provide Bitcoin services and be based in New York at the same time, it's now impossible, essentially, because everything has to be overseen by some ombudsman that can't even write hello world on a command line. So it's very important to allow the market to address all the problems that people have and the opportunities that people have in using Bitcoin, and to not get involved with the day-to-day running of how things are done. The market can take care of all this itself, and that's another part of libertarianism. That the market is the best way to allocate resources, solve problems, and serve people. And I think that's absolutely undeniable. Certainly in software, the internet we have today could never have existed if people weren't free to write and release software and serve whoever they want in whatever way people found mutually acceptable.
Right. And I think to piggyback on that, in my own mind, I think just like any other software, open source software, Bitcoin, there's a lot of freedom. There's a lot of choice to run it how you want. But there's also a lot of responsibility. It's essentially, and a lot of people who are involved in Bitcoin say stuff like this, but it's essentially being your own bank, right? And a lot of I don't want to call them nerds, but a lot of the really nerdy techie people are like really on about, oh yeah, like let's be our own bank. Oh, it's so great. But your average everyday person like has no interest in wanting to be their own bank, right? Like that's just something none of us ever think about as like, well, I just, we think like, well, I just have a bank and it's just so easy and it's just part of my life already. If I want to be my own bank, oh, okay, well, how do I do that? Now that means I'm completely responsible for my own money. So when I talk about us having the iPhone moment in Bitcoin, I think I'm also alluding to not only ease of use, but like the security practices and everything like that. That's just going to be so well integrated that you don't even think of it as being your own bank. It's just, it's built in from the ground up to be almost dummy proof.
Exactly right. And that's what Instagram and the Twitter clients essentially are. There's no difference between Samurai Wallet, Instagram, and the Twitter client. Nobody who has an Instagram thinks I'm my own publisher. They don't think that. When they have a Twitter account, they don't think I'm my own group messenger. They just use it. And once people get these well-designed products into their hands, ways of thinking about them, like saying be your own bank, will not have any meaning, because they'll just be using them to buy things and receive things, or buy things and receive money with their telephones. So the nomenclature and the analogies used by people in Bitcoin, even though they're totally true, where you're actually being your own bank, it's not the proper way to sell these products to a billion people. You ask somebody to be their own bank, it frightens them, because what happens to banks? Banks get robbed. So you don't want people to think like that. You want them to think that they can buy things online with their phone using Bitcoin. They can send money with Bitcoin on their phone. They don't have to line up at Western Union anymore to send money. They don't have to go to Western Union or to their bank or anywhere else to do anything with money. They can just do it all on their phone worldwide. And if you sell it like that, you sell only the convenience and leave out all of these true but hard to understand analogies, then you've got a problem. And of course, famously, Barack Hussein Obama said that people having a bank in their pocket could be a quote unquote a problem. Well, it's not a problem. It's an opportunity, first of all. And secondly, this is another side effect of telling people that they have a bank in their phone, or in this case, a Swiss bank in their phone. That analogy and that way of describing Bitcoin can cause trouble, because if people think that Bitcoin is a Swiss bank account in their pocket, the connotations of a Swiss bank account get superimposed onto Bitcoin, whereas in fact, that's not the full picture. It's no different to having Instagram on your telephone or Twitter or Facebook. It's just a way of sending messages. In this case, all the messages are inside the Bitcoin network, whereas all the Twitter messages are on the Twitter network and Facebook messages are all on the Facebook network. So we have to be very careful how we talk about this, and also be careful about giving people the wrong idea by using the correct analogies. Saying you have a bank in your pocket is okay for Bitcoin Twitter and for people, Bitcoiners talking to each other. But if we're talking about communicating the idea of Bitcoin to the public, that's a dangerous idea, because it makes people think things that are actually not correct. And, the next thing you know, you've got a bit license popping up here, there, and everywhere else, and Bank Secrecy Act and all kinds of other nonsense impacting Bitcoin companies. And that's a problem. So we need to tell the truth about Bitcoin and leave the analogies and the language we use to describe services out of that picture.
So what is it going to take for libertarians, libertarian-minded people who are not really sure about Bitcoin to convince them? What are we going to do to convince them that this is a money they should use?
Well, I think when the market speaks, a lot of these people will just start to use Bitcoin because that's what the market expects. It's very difficult to get people to accept Bitcoin who are hostile to it, especially if they think that the regression theorem is the only way a real money can merge and all this kind of stuff. So if you're predisposed to not liking Bitcoin, it has to come from the market. The urge to, the spur to use it has to come from the market. And if all these people who are against Bitcoin, all of them have credit cards, they all use fiat, and they all have bank accounts. So if banks start offering Bitcoin services, they'll accept it. If their coffee shop down the road starts accepting Bitcoin, they'll get it. They'll get it so they can drink their coffee. They have to live. If their ISP all of a sudden says, we only take payments in Bitcoin, you can be sure they'll get a Bitcoin wallet. They'll get a Samurai wallet. They'll go buy a voucher for the $20 to pay their bill, and they will pay in Bitcoin. So a lot of these people will be dragged into the future, kicking and screaming, no doubt, but they will come along. And I think more important than trying to convince people by speaking to them is to create the services that make it a no-brainer that Bitcoin is something they need to use. And so once that happens, the floodgates will be open, and there'll be many, many, many millions of users coming along from every kind of background. It's just like using Twitter. There's somebody from every single political persuasion on Twitter, and the same thing will happen with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just a tool, just like a hammer. And so, communists can use hammers, and so can Republicans. Of course, the communists use them in the hammer and sickle, but that's another story.
It almost sounds like we're talking about Bitcoin, because we're talking about it daily use, and we're getting into, then we get into the technical side of the daily use and using it for coffee and all that sort of stuff. Well, it doesn't scale. It's, you start getting into the whole block debate.
Well, the thing is that this business about Bitcoin not scaling is just utter nonsense. And you can go onto the Google and find other instances of different services who are thought not to be scalable. It's almost like a meme. And a lot of the people who talk about Bitcoin not being scalable are not software developers. Before Lightning emerged, people were saying that Bitcoin couldn't scale. And of course, before Open Dime, people said that Bitcoin couldn't scale. But both of these things allow Bitcoin to scale massively. So you have to be very careful about when people who are not software developers or people who have no experience in how different technologies evolve over time or grow and change over time, saying that something is impossible. Impossible is a bad word. Impossible is not something, it's not a word people who understand anything use. It's just it's very, very, very dangerous. So I don't have any worry about Bitcoin scaling. And also my maximum horizon, my maximum scenario of where Bitcoin can or cannot be used is not limited. So there are some people who say that Bitcoin will only be used by, as a global reserve because it takes too long to reconcile everything. But it's almost like they don't know that Lightning even exists. No, Lightning actually does exist. And it means that there are going to be billions of transactions happening every day that are super, super cheap, just like the original Bitcoin before the network was very large used to be. And Lightning is only one way that this can happen. All you have to do is just sit down and think for a moment. Let's say that the Open Dime sticks that are done by the wonderful Rodolfo, that there's 100 million of them, all with Bitcoin on them, and they never get reconciled to the Bitcoin blockchain. People will use those sticks as money, basically cash money, cash in hand, that are all verifiable and that can accumulate Bitcoin as they get older and older and older, and only get broken when they have sort of a lot of Bitcoin that nobody wants to keep on an Open Dime. Then they get reconciled to the blockchain. But it's very possible that there's millions upon millions of these Open Dime devices that are being used as a cash money. And all of a sudden, Bitcoin is being used for day-to-day purchases in the way that people would have thought is not possible because the Bitcoin network's inherent and necessary limitations. So we have to be very careful about saying X is not possible or X will only be used as this or the proper way to do something is Y. Just be very, very careful, especially when those words come from people who don't develop software or who are not experienced in the way that new products can be developed, new systems can be developed. So that's my stock response when I hear people say that something is not possible in Bitcoin. Don't believe it for an instant.
Thank you for tuning in to Bitcoin Matters. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a thumbs up on YouTube or a review in the iTunes store. To learn more about Bitcoin Matters, please visit us at bitcoinmatterspodcast.com.